The story begins in silence. Not the kind of silence you find in an empty room, but the silence of a place so saturated with death that even the wind seems hesitant to pass through. Imagine a stretch of uneven ground, earth rising and falling like waves frozen in place, each mound a resting place for someone who once breathed, once loved, once feared the very things we now fear. And yet, not a single marker bears their name. This is not just a graveyard, it is an ocean of anonymity. Thousands of graves, laid out in rows and clusters, all swallowed by grass, moss, and centuries of forgetting. No tombstones, no plaques, no records. Just soil, bones, and a chilling absence of memory. When we think of cemeteries, we imagine marble headstones, epitaphs, dates carved into stone, flowers placed by grieving relatives who return year after year to honor the dead. But here, there is none of that. The dead here are nameless. And in death, they have been silenced even more brutally than in life. What kind of place buries its dead like this? What kind of history demands that thousands of bodies be hidden in plain sight, stripped of their identities, denied the basic dignity of remembrance? Locals whisper that this cemetery should not be disturbed. They say the land is cursed. They tell stories of strange sounds at night, faint cries carried on the wind, footsteps that vanish in the grass, shadowy figures seen standing motionless among the mounds before dissolving into the mist. Some claim that even animals refuse to graze near the soil, as if they sense what humans have long chosen to ignore. But beneath these ghost stories lies a truth even more unsettling: the official record offers nothing. No church logs, no government archives, no burial registers. For a site that holds thousands of the dead, there is almost no mention of it in any historical documents. It is as though the dead themselves were meant to disappear, not just from life, but from history itself. This is where our journey begins. We will step into the shadow of this forgotten cemetery, peeling back the layers of myth, secrecy, and silence. We will listen to the whispers of the past, sift through fragments of evidence, and follow the trail of those who dared to investigate before us. Along the way, we will ask the questions no one seems to want answered: who lies beneath these mounds? Why were their names erased? And what does it mean when an entire community, an entire generation, is buried without a trace? To understand this place, we must approach it carefully. This is not a mystery solved by one clue, one revelation. It is a slow unraveling, a descent into a past that has been deliberately obscured. Every layer we uncover may disturb something meant to remain hidden. Every answer will lead to darker questions. This cemetery does not give up its secrets easily. And perhaps that is why it has survived for so long, untouched and unchallenged. But the fact remains: thousands of people lived, died, and were buried here, and we know almost nothing about them. It's a chilling thought. We often comfort ourselves with the idea that history remembers the important things. That the dead rest peacefully because their names and lives are preserved in memory. But here, memory has been stripped away like flesh from bone. All that remains is silence. And silence can be dangerous. Because when history forgets, it usually isn't an accident. As we move deeper into this mystery, remember one thing: every unmarked grave is a question. Every erased name is a story stolen. And the more we uncover, the more we risk realizing that this isn't just a story about the past, it's also a story about the lengths to which the living will go to control memory, to bury truth, and to ensure that some voices are never heard again. The question is, who wanted them forgotten? The answer, if there is one, begins here, in the cemetery of nameless graves. Every community clings to its stories. And when history leaves behind only silence, folklore rushes in to fill the void. In the villages that border the cemetery, stories about this nameless field of the dead are passed down in hushed tones, often told late at night, when shadows stretch long and the boundaries between the living and the departed seem thinner. These stories, as fragmented and contradictory as they are, form the only surviving record of the cemetery's existence. They are not written in books. They are not preserved in archives. They live only in the words of those who whisper them, grandparents to grandchildren, neighbors to strangers, gossip exchanged in candlelight. The most common tale paints the cemetery as a plague ground. Centuries ago, the story goes, disease swept through the region like wildfire. Some say it was the Black Death, others claim it was cholera, influenza, or even a strange fever that had no name at all. Entire families perished overnight, and the living were too terrified to bury the dead in their own churchyards. Out of fear, the bodies were carried in carts and dumped into mass graves, hastily covered with soil. In this version of the story, the anonymity of the cemetery was born from panic. No time for names, no time for prayers. Just endless bodies, shoveled into the earth before the sickness could spread further. And so the field became a monument not to reverence, but to fear. But there are darker stories too. Some villagers whisper of soldiers. Not the celebrated heroes carved into statues, but prisoners of war, nameless, faceless men marched out into the fields, executed, and buried where they fell. Their uniforms rotted away long ago, their weapons confiscated, their identities erased with a single order. In this telling, the cemetery is not a place of tragic accident, but of deliberate cruelty, a site of forgotten executions hidden from official memory. Others insist the dead belong to the poor, beggars, migrants, indentured workers, and enslaved people whose deaths were inconvenient to record. Without families powerful enough to demand a proper burial, they were carried here in the dead of night, their bodies lowered into shallow graves, never to be spoken of again. And yet, there are legends more chilling still. One story, repeated almost identically in two different villages miles apart, tells of a man who entered the cemetery at dusk, long after he had been warned not to. They say he was drunk, stumbling through the mounds, mocking the idea that the dead could harm the living. The villagers watched from a distance as the man disappeared among the graves. He never came back. The next morning, his footprints trailed into the field, and stopped at a mound of earth. Some swear they heard muffled cries that night, as though the soil itself swallowed him whole. Skeptics laugh at this, but believers nod solemnly. For them, it is proof that the cemetery does not simply hold the dead, it keeps them. There are also tales of the night watchers. Shadowy figures said to patrol the field when the moon is high, appearing as dark silhouettes against the mist. They never move quickly, never chase, never speak. They simply stand among the graves, as though guarding something, or someone, buried beneath. Travelers who encounter them describe an overwhelming sense of dread, the kind of fear that tightens your chest and steals your breath. And when they dared to blink, the figures were gone. These stories, of course, are easy to dismiss as superstition, products of fear and imagination. But there's something unsettling about how consistent the tales are. Even families who claim never to have believed in ghosts still warn their children never to step foot into the cemetery after dark. Why such persistence? Why such fear? One elder, when asked why the cemetery has no records, gave a chilling answer: because it was never meant to be remembered. Some graves are dug for the dead. Others are dug for secrets. That sentence lingers like smoke. And it raises uncomfortable possibilities. Could folklore be more than just stories? Could these whispered accounts contain fragments of truth, distorted but not invented? In history, legends often form around real traumas, growing like vines around the ruins of memory. Perhaps the plague stories reflect a genuine epidemic. Perhaps the soldier tales hint at a massacre never officially documented. Perhaps the shadows in the night are simply the conscience of a community, manifesting as stories because silence is too heavy to bear. But here's the most haunting thought: what if all the stories are true? What if this field of nameless graves is not the result of one tragedy, but many? Layer upon layer of suffering, stacked in soil until it became impossible to separate one horror from the next. This is the unsettling truth of folklore: it blurs the line between fact and fiction, memory and myth. And in doing so, it keeps the dead alive, even if only in whispers. As we move forward, we must remember that folklore often foreshadows history. Legends are born for a reason. And when so many voices across generations repeat the same warnings, the same images, the same fears, perhaps we should not be so quick to dismiss them. Because sometimes, the oldest stories are the closest we will ever come to the truth. And in the case of this cemetery, those whispers in the dust may be the only voices the nameless dead still have. To understand the silence of this cemetery, we have to step back, not a few years, not even a few decades, but centuries. Because places like this do not simply appear. They are shaped, layer by layer, by human history, and human neglect. The land surrounding the cemetery has seen the passage of countless empires, conflicts, and catastrophes. Each era left behind scars, but not always explanations. If we look closely enough, we can trace faint outlines of events that might have given birth to this vast sea of unmarked graves. The shadow of disease in the late Middle Ages, Europe and much of the wider world endured waves of devastating plagues. The Black Death alone wiped out an estimated one-third of entire populations. But plagues did not vanish after one cataclysmic outbreak, they returned, again and again, in cycles of death and fear. When an epidemic struck, fear dictated everything. Families abandoned their loved ones. Priests refused to administer last rites. In desperation, entire towns turned fields into plague pits, mass graves where bodies were dumped without ceremony. Survival was the only priority, dignity was a luxury. Could this cemetery be one of those pits? The legends suggest as much. And the sheer scale, thousands of burials, points toward a catastrophe far larger than ordinary mortality. But there is a complication. Normally, plague pits left behind some form of record. Even in chaos, chroniclers scribbled notes of death tolls, church registers logged burials en masse, governments issued proclamations of quarantine. Yet here, there is nothing. It's as if the plague, if it was one, was meant to be erased. The violence of war history also tells us this region was no stranger to war. Armies clashed here across centuries, religious conflicts, territorial disputes, and revolutions that toppled kings. For every celebrated battlefield, there were darker corners where no official victory was recorded, only slaughter. Captured soldiers rarely fared well. Many were executed outright, their deaths unworthy of commemoration. Others were left to rot in makeshift camps, succumbing to starvation, disease, or exposure. Their bodies, unclaimed and unwanted, were shoveled into anonymous graves. One fragment of an 18th-century military report makes a cryptic reference to an open field for the fallen, beyond the western village. The coordinates are imprecise, but some researchers believe it could refer to the very land where the cemetery lies today. If true, it would mean the field once swallowed not only civilians, but entire battalions of the forgotten. Yet again, there is a silence where the story should be loud. No official account mentions the burial of thousands. No monument stands. No records name the dead. For a war that produced endless documents and reports, this omission feels deliberate. The poor, the marginalized, the unclaimed. If war and plague do not fully explain the cemetery, perhaps the answer lies in something quieter, but no less tragic: poverty. For centuries, the poor were denied even the dignity of a grave with a name. Those who could not afford burial fees were often placed in communal pits, known by terms like paupers' fields, or potter's fields. These were the graveyards of society's outcasts, the indigent, the homeless, the enslaved, migrants without families, orphans with no one to claim them. The unmarked cemetery could very well be such a site. But even paupers' fields usually left traces in church records, entries like John Doe, beggar, buried without stone. In this cemetery, however, there are no such ledgers. Not one name survives. And that raises an unsettling question: was this truly poverty, or was poverty used as an excuse to erase certain people altogether? Missing pages, burned records. The deeper historians looked, the stranger the gaps became. Church records from nearby parishes have entire decades missing. Government census rolls are torn, their ink smeared, as though someone deliberately destroyed them. Local archives were hit by mysterious fires, not once, but multiple times, conveniently erasing the very years when the cemetery saw its heaviest use. Coincidence? Perhaps. But for investigators, the pattern is unmistakable. Someone did not just forget these people. Someone wanted them forgotten. In one archive basement, a brittle old map was uncovered. Faded ink marked the cemetery site with a chilling label, "For the Unclaimed." 2 words, brief, bureaucratic, and devastating. Who were the unclaimed? Were they plague victims with no surviving relatives? Prisoners with no rights to a burial? Or citizens whose families were forced to look away, threatened into silence? The map offers no answers, only another question. Layers of tragedy. What makes this cemetery so haunting is not just its size, but the possibility that it was not the result of a single event. Unlike a battlefield or a plague pit tied to one moment in time, this cemetery seems to have been used repeatedly, across generations. Bones from one century may rest beside bones from another. Infants beside soldiers. Men and women buried together without distinction, as if the soil was less a sacred resting place and more a dumping ground for lives that history refused to carry forward. If true, this makes the cemetery not just a site of death, but of continuity. A pattern of forgetting, repeated over and over, until the ground itself became heavy with secrets. The weight of erasure. History, after all, is not just what is remembered. It is also what is deliberately erased. When names vanish, when records burn, when whole generations are reduced to numbers, the silence is never accidental. It is curated, engineered. And that silence lingers like a shadow over this cemetery. Every mound of earth is a reminder that someone made a choice, to bury the body, but not the memory. To erase not only life, but even the possibility of remembrance. A cliffhanger in the past. As we sift through the fragments of history, the epidemics, the wars, the poverty, the missing records, we begin to see faint outlines. Yet none of them fully explain the cemetery. Each theory feels plausible, each adds weight, but the whole picture remains just out of reach, like a painting viewed through fog. And then comes the discovery that changes everything. Hidden in a private collection, a tattered ledger surfaces. Its pages are stained, its ink faded almost to invisibility. But scrawled across one entry is a single phrase that chills the spine: burial field, names forbidden. Forbidden. Not lost. Not forgotten. Forbidden. The cemetery is no longer just a question of neglect or circumstance. It may be something much darker. And that is where the mystery deepens. When we speak of thousands of nameless graves, it is easy to think in numbers. But numbers are cold. Numbers are distant. 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, they blur into abstraction, stripped of individuality. Yet beneath every mound in this cemetery lies a person who once had a face, a voice, a heartbeat. Someone who laughed, who feared, who dreamed. The silence of this place is deceptive. Because if we listen closely, if we allow ourselves to imagine, fragments of their lives begin to surface. The laborer. Picture a man in his 30s. His hands calloused from years of fieldwork, his body stooped from carrying loads far too heavy for far too long. He may have been a farmhand, or perhaps a miner, one of the countless workers whose names were never recorded in payrolls, whose deaths were never mentioned in town records. At night, he might have returned to a shack where his family awaited him, children with hollow eyes, a wife stitching torn clothing by candlelight. For them, survival was a daily calculation: one more loaf of bread, one more winter coat, one more prayer that tomorrow would not bring sickness. And when sickness inevitably came, fever, cough, or injury that festered into infection, he died quietly, not in a hospital bed, not surrounded by doctors, but on a straw mattress, his children too frightened to approach. His body, like so many others, was carried away, and the cemetery became his final resting place. No cross. No name. Only soil. The child. In another grave lies a child, perhaps no older than 6. Her tiny shoes were found during an excavation, leather cracked but still intact after centuries underground. Imagine her world: games played in dirt roads, laughter ringing in the alleys, a small wooden toy clutched in her hand. But children of the poor had little protection against the world's cruelties. An epidemic could sweep through a village and claim dozens of young lives in days. Malnutrition weakened them before they even had a chance to grow. Her family may have wept as her body was lowered into the ground. Or perhaps, and this thought chills us even more, perhaps they were too stricken by grief to even follow her to the burial site. Perhaps they never knew where she was taken. Her laughter ended, her story erased. Only the faint trace of her shoes survived to whisper that she was ever here. The soldier imagine, too, the soldier. Young, perhaps not yet 20, conscripted into a war he did not understand. He marched with his comrades into battle, carrying a musket or sword, terrified and determined in equal measure. He fought not for glory, but because he was ordered to, because refusing meant death. And when the battle ended, he lay among hundreds of others, his blood mixing with soil, his face turned skyward. No family claimed him. No commander honored him. Instead, his body was dragged with the rest, tossed into a pit, covered hastily, forgotten as quickly as the order had been given. His comrades who survived may have spoken his name once, maybe twice, before moving on to the next march, the next fight. And then silence. The woman without a voice among the graves are women whose stories history rarely bothered to tell. Wives, mothers, daughters, laborers in fields and factories, orphans placed in institutions where cruelty often replaced care. Some may have been victims of violence, their deaths never investigated, their bodies quietly removed to keep scandal at bay. One artifact, a rosary bead found near a cluster of female skeletons, suggests a woman buried clutching a symbol of faith. Was she praying for salvation as she died? Was the rosary placed in her hand by someone who loved her, or by a stranger following routine? Her name is gone, her prayers unheard. And yet, the small bead is enough to remind us she was real. The silenced communities beyond individuals, we must imagine whole groups whose very existence was erased. Migrant laborers brought from distant lands, who died far from home, their families never knowing where their bodies lay. Enslaved men and women, denied not only freedom in life but dignity in death. Prisoners, political dissidents, rebels, or those simply deemed inconvenient, who vanished into the soil, their absence explained away with lies. For these communities, erasure was not an accident. It was policy. To deny a person their name is to deny their humanity. To bury them without record is to declare, you do not matter. You never existed. And yet, here they are, resting together in this vast cemetery of silence, their very presence contradicting the attempt to erase them. The shared humanity. What binds all these imagined lives together is not their anonymity, but their humanity. The laborer who worked until his body broke. The child who never grew up. The soldier who fought and fell. The woman who prayed with her final breath. None of them could have imagined that centuries later, strangers would stand above their graves, asking who they were. But perhaps that is the only comfort we can give them now, to remember, even if imperfectly, that they once lived. The chilling hint of violence, and yet, as moving as these reconstructions are, there is something darker hiding beneath them. Excavations revealed more than just ordinary burials. Some skeletons bore marks of blunt force trauma to the skull. Others had broken wrists, suggesting restraint. A few had no signs of disease or injury at all, as though their deaths were sudden, unexplained. Could it be that not all of the dead here were victims of accident, plague, or poverty? Could some of them have been killed deliberately, their anonymity enforced to conceal the crime? This possibility transforms the cemetery from a site of tragedy to a site of horror. If the nameless graves hide not just forgotten lives, but silenced lives, then the question shifts from how they died to who wanted them erased. The power of memory. There is a cruel irony here. Those who buried these bodies without names sought to erase them. But in doing so, they created a mystery that ensures these people are still spoken of centuries later. Every unmarked mound forces us to wonder. Every missing record forces us to imagine. And in imagining, we breathe life back into those who were denied it. Perhaps this is the only justice left to them, that their silence demands to be broken. That their anonymity forces us to remember, even if we can never know their names. Foreshadowing the darkness ahead, but as powerful as these human reconstructions are, they cannot answer the deeper mystery. They tell us who the dead might have been, but not why their names were erased, why the records vanished, why entire communities were buried under layers of forgetting. To uncover that, we must turn to those who refuse to let the silence stand, the investigators, the historians, the archaeologists who risked everything to peel back the earth and confront what lay beneath. And what they found suggests the story of this cemetery is far darker than anyone imagined. History, as we often say, is written by the living. But some histories are deliberately buried, hidden beneath layers of soil, dust, and time. It takes someone willing to challenge the silence to uncover them, and in the case of this nameless cemetery, a small group of determined investigators took on that daunting task. They were not heroes in the traditional sense. They were scholars, archivists, archaeologists, and anthropologists, people drawn to puzzles, driven by curiosity, and haunted by the idea that thousands of lives had been erased. And each of them carried their own burdens, their own obsessions, their own personal reasons for seeking the truth. The historian, piecing together fragments. Dr. Anika Varma, a local historian in her 40s, approached the cemetery not with shovels, but with ink-stained fingers and a mind honed to spot gaps in the historical record. She spent years combing through parish records, newspapers, and old diaries. Every missing page, every blacked-out ledger, and every contradictory account became a clue, a breadcrumb leading her closer to the reality beneath the soil. "I kept hitting walls," she said in a quiet interview. "Every record we found about this area had something missing. It was as if someone had deliberately erased centuries of memory." Her obsession was not abstract. She imagined the faces of the dead, reconstructed their lives from scant evidence, and felt a responsibility to give them back a fragment of dignity. Yet even she was unprepared for what the field would reveal. The archaeologist, reading bones like a story, entered Dr. Marcus Lyon, a forensic archaeologist specializing in mass graves. Where historians traced the gaps in paperwork, he examined the earth itself. For months, he and his team excavated, catalogued, and analyzed skeletal remains, careful not to disturb anything unnecessarily. Each skeleton told a story: the angle of a fracture, the erosion of teeth, traces of disease or malnutrition. Some bones suggested old age and illness, others hinted at violence. Marcus described the work as reading the past line by line, except the lines have been deliberately erased. And yet, the bones sometimes spoke louder than any document could. The placement of multiple bodies together, signs of binding, or marks consistent with blunt trauma suggested deliberate acts. In a field supposedly of the unclaimed dead, some deaths were anything but natural. The archivist, chasing shadows. Then there was Ravi Deshmukh, a younger archivist whose fascination with lost documents brought him to the investigation. His days were spent in dimly lit basements, poring over fragile ledgers and newspapers yellowed with age. He followed every rumor, every anecdote recorded in passing, every vague reference to the Western burial grounds he could find. It was Ravi who first discovered the burned and torn records, the repeated patterns of missing decades, and, most importantly, the map marking the site as, for the unclaimed. For him, the discovery was both thrilling and horrifying, proof that the cemetery was no accident. "There's an intentionality here," he told colleagues. "Someone decided these lives didn't matter. And in doing so, they tried to make us forget too." The relentless search together, the team approached the investigation as both a historical and moral imperative. They combined archaeology, anthropology, archival research, and even oral interviews with local residents. Every step revealed more questions than answers. Skeletons buried in layers from different centuries suggested repeated use. Shards of pottery, buttons, and other artifacts hinted at different social classes, ages, and perhaps even different ethnic groups. Small personal items, a locket, a child's shoe, fragments of clothing, gave fleeting glimpses into the humanity of the dead. The process was painstaking, frustrating, and emotionally exhausting. Every discovery brought relief and wonder, followed almost immediately by more dread. Encounters with the unknown, but the investigators didn't just wrestle with the past. They also faced the eerie present. While cataloging the graves, Dr. Lyon noticed inexplicable patterns in the soil, depressions that seemed too precise, almost intentional, and small disturbances that could not be explained by erosion. Locals warned of voices in the wind, of shadows among the mounds. Some team members admitted to feeling watched, a cold presence brushing past them during long days in the field. It was as if the cemetery itself was alive, one assistant whispered. Not alive in a good way, but like it remembered everything that happened here, and it didn't want us digging around. Skeptics in the group laughed it off at first, attributing it to exhaustion or imagination. But over time, the pattern became hard to ignore. Instruments detected sudden drops in temperature. Cameras captured anomalies in the mist. And footprints, inexplicable footprints, were occasionally found where no one had walked. Whether coincidence, natural phenomenon, or something else entirely, these experiences heightened the tension. The dead, it seemed, did not rest quietly. First breakthroughs. Despite these unsettling events, the team achieved breakthroughs. Using isotopic analysis, Dr. Lyon was able to estimate the origins of some individuals, revealing a mixture of locals and outsiders, some from regions hundreds of miles away. Radiocarbon dating confirmed burials spanning multiple centuries. Artifacts and skeletal evidence hinted at the possibility of violent deaths among certain groups. Personal items suggested that the dead were not random, but belonged to communities once active in the area. And archival records, when cross-referenced with oral accounts, began to hint at deliberate erasure. The picture forming was darker and more complex than anyone had anticipated. This cemetery was not merely a pauper's field, a plague pit, or a battlefield. It was all of these things, and possibly something else, a deliberate hiding place for lives deemed inconvenient, lives someone wanted forgotten. Emotional toll on the investigators. It is easy to imagine that investigators approach history as an intellectual exercise. But in reality, the work exacts a profound emotional toll. Dr. Varma often left the site shaken, haunted by the faces she imagined. Dr. Lyon confessed that examining evidence of trauma on the bones made him feel complicit in uncovering cruelty he could not prevent. Ravi, the archivist, spoke of nightmares, rows of nameless graves, and the weight of thousands of stories he would never fully know. They were not merely studying the dead. They were carrying their silence forward, piecing together fragments of life stolen long ago, and in doing so, inviting the past to haunt their own present. A mini cliffhanger, and then came the discovery that would push the investigation into truly chilling territory. During one late excavation, Dr. Lyon uncovered a cluster of skeletons with clear signs of restraint, wrists bound, ankles broken, some showing multiple impacts to the skull. Small personal items suggested these were not plague victims, nor ordinary laborers. The items hinted at deliberate selection, men, women, even children buried in secret, their deaths unrecorded, their graves unmarked. For the team, this was the first evidence that this cemetery may hide more than forgotten lives. It could hide deliberate, violent acts that someone tried to erase completely. And if that was true, the next question loomed like a storm cloud: who were the perpetrators? And how deep did the conspiracy of silence go? The answers would not be easy. In fact, they might never come. But the investigators pressed on, driven by the knowledge that the nameless dead had no one else to speak for them, no voice, no record, no advocate. And so the search continued, each layer of soil peeled back, revealing not just bones, but secrets. The deeper the investigators dug, the darker the questions became. Mass graves can tell many stories. Some speak of disease, others of poverty, and still others of accidental deaths during disasters. But when multiple anomalies converge in the same location, bound skeletons, blunt force trauma, layered burials spanning centuries, and the erasure of all names, it signals something far more sinister. The cemetery of nameless graves does not whisper tragedy alone. It hints at deliberate, calculated violence. And that is what makes this place so chilling. It is a space where human cruelty may have stacked itself, generation after generation, and yet left almost no trace in written history. Theory 1. Epidemics concealed as ordinary death. One prevailing theory is deceptively simple. The cemetery was used to bury plague or epidemic victims, but on a scale so large that it demanded secrecy. Records may have been destroyed to avoid panic, or manipulated to maintain the reputation of the surrounding communities. Indeed, the skeletal evidence sometimes supports this: bone deterioration consistent with disease, malnutrition, and stress. Children make up a significant portion of the remains, which aligns with the demographic most vulnerable to epidemics. But there are contradictions. Some bodies show no signs of illness or malnutrition. Others display fractures inconsistent with disease. And certain burial patterns, bodies stacked in deliberate arrangements, artifacts deliberately left with or removed from the dead, suggest intentionality beyond mere emergency disposal. Could it be that epidemic was only part of the story? That in some cases, the dead were not victims of disease, but victims of human hands? Theory 2, War, Rebellion, and Mass Executions. Another theory is rooted in history's darker side. The cemetery could be the final resting place of soldiers, prisoners, or rebels executed en masse. Conflicts in the region spanned centuries: religious wars, peasant uprisings, and regional skirmishes that left thousands unrecorded. The presence of adult male skeletons with evidence of restraint or trauma supports this possibility. Some historical fragments mention burial grounds for the unclaimed and dishonored, a phrase that now takes on an ominous meaning. One particularly unsettling discovery was a cluster of graves containing both adults and adolescents, suggesting the possibility of captured rebels, families punished collectively, or young soldiers executed for defiance. These weren't incidental deaths from the battlefield, these were systematic, targeted acts. The implication is horrifying: someone wanted these deaths forgotten not because they were shameful accidents, but because they were deliberate crimes. Theory 3. Institutional abuse. Beyond war and disease lies another shadow, that of institutions themselves. Orphanages, workhouses, and detention centers existed in the region for centuries, many operating with brutal efficiency. Children, the elderly, and marginalized adults were sent into these institutions with promises of shelter or reform, only to die in neglect or abuse. Artifacts such as chains, restraints, and personal effects hint at this theory. Some skeletons show evidence of malnutrition, repeated injuries, or restraint, consistent with long-term captivity. The cemetery could have served as a burial site for those who died under care, but whose deaths were inconvenient to report. Historical rumors support this. Locals whispered of an institution in the late 18th century that disappeared almost entirely from records, a building where many were sent, and few ever returned. Could some of the nameless dead belong to victims of systematic institutional abuse? Theory 4. State-sanctioned cover. UPS. Perhaps the darkest theory of all involves deliberate state-sanctioned erasure. Governments, empires, and local authorities have historically covered up massacres, epidemics, and political purges. In the case of this cemetery, the total absence of records, repeated burned archives, blacked-out ledgers, and deliberate mislabeling of burial grounds, raises the possibility of official complicity. Declassified documents found decades later hint at controlled burial grounds for the unclaimed, with instructions to minimize any public acknowledgement. Some suggest that prisoners, dissenters, and marginalized populations were intentionally buried here to remove them from collective memory. If true, this theory paints the cemetery not just as a tragedy of neglect, but as an instrument of control. To erase a life is to erase influence, history, and story. And in that sense, the cemetery becomes a monument to power exercised in secrecy. Conflicting evidence and mystery theories multiply, but none explain everything. Some graves suggest epidemic, others violence. Some date back centuries, others appear more recent. Skeletal analysis confirms multiple causes of death, yet artifacts and trauma indicate intentional concealment. The investigators are left with fragments, tantalizing, horrifying fragments, each pointing in a different direction. Some bodies may have died of natural causes. Others may have been executed. Some may have perished in institutions. Some may have been erased deliberately by authorities. The sheer variety creates a tension that is impossible to resolve fully. Every grave holds a story, yet the full narrative remains obscured. Human faces behind theories despite the uncertainty, the investigators persist, humanizing the dead even when their exact identities are unknowable. There is the adolescent boy, evidence of malnutrition on his bones, buried next to a woman with fractures on her wrists. Were they siblings, or prisoners? There is the adult male, bound and buried with a simple tool beside him, perhaps a laborer, perhaps a rebel executed for defiance. There are clusters of infants, tiny skeletons curled in the earth, hinting at systemic neglect or worse. These faces make the theories unbearable. Numbers alone do not convey horror. But imagining the lives, the fear, and the suffering behind each grave forces the viewer, and the investigators, to confront the human consequences of silence, secrecy, and violence. The rising tension, every artifact, every skeletal anomaly, every missing record compounds the mystery. The investigators begin to feel the psychological weight of the place. At night, they described feeling watched. Instruments detect inexplicable readings. Some team members report hearing faint voices, the kind that carry across open fields in the wind, whispering names that have been erased. The boundary between past and present seems to blur, as though the cemetery itself refuses to remain inert. This rising tension is compounded by the realization that some answers, if uncovered, could implicate not just distant historical actors, but institutions still powerful in the present. Every revelation comes with risk, academic, political, even personal. Foreshadowing the next stage, and yet, the investigators push forward, piecing together patterns, connecting the fragments. Each theory is a thread: epidemic, war, institutional abuse, state-sanctioned cover-up, and all threads lead to a horrifying possibility: the cemetery is not the result of a single tragedy, but multiple tragedies repeated over centuries, deliberately hidden, deliberately anonymized. The cumulative effect is staggering: a mass burial ground spanning generations, each grave a potential witness to human cruelty, neglect, or erasure. And buried beneath layers of soil and secrecy may lie evidence so damning it could rewrite parts of the region's history. The stakes have never been higher. The question that now dominates every thought is no longer, who is buried here, but, who allowed it to happen? And why has no one spoken of it for so long? By now, the investigators had uncovered what few expected: a cemetery of nameless graves stretching for acres, evidence of violent deaths, repeated epidemics, and burial patterns suggesting deliberate concealment. Yet, no amount of archaeological data could answer the most pressing question: who buried them? Who ordered their deaths? And why had history erased them? The answer, or at least part of it, lay not beneath the soil, but in the paper, ink, and parchment that should have preserved the past. But when the investigators turned to official records, they encountered nothing but emptiness. The missing church ledgers. Churches, historically, were the custodians of life and death. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, each meticulously logged. But the parishes surrounding the cemetery had conspicuous gaps. Entire decades were missing. Ledgers had been torn, water-stained, or intentionally blacked out. Dr. Varma recalls the moment she realized the pattern was too systematic to be accidental. These weren't the results of fire, flood, or decay, she said. The erasures were too precise. Someone went through the trouble of removing names. Entire communities had been wiped from memory. In one case, a ledger listed dozens of burials simply as unknown or unclaimed, even though contemporary newspapers noted the deaths. In another, entries for children, laborers, and prisoners simply vanished. The meticulous care with which names were excised suggested forethought, a deliberate effort to erase existence itself. Burned archives and destroyed evidence. If church records had been only partially removed, the investigators might have had hope. But the government archives told a similar story. Fires, floods, and accidental damage had destroyed decades of official documentation. Ravi, the archivist, described the discovery as chilling. It wasn't just missing pages, he said. Entire collections of documents were gone. Reports, census data, letters, even legal proceedings, everything relating to the cemetery's active period had disappeared. It was as if someone wanted to ensure that no historian, no scholar, and no family could ever trace these deaths. Fragments that survived hinted at something deeply sinister. Scattered references in secondary sources suggested that the cemetery had been known as a field for the unclaimed, a bureaucratic euphemism that masked more than simple poverty. It was a phrase that suggested intentionality, planning, and control. Confession from a former caretaker. The first real human voice hinting at deliberate action came from a man who had been a caretaker decades earlier. On his deathbed, he confessed to a local journalist, "They told me never to mark the graves. Never ask who they were. They said remembering would only cause trouble, for everyone." The statement was brief, almost casual, yet its implications were staggering. A single instruction, "Never mark the graves," implied authority. Someone with power, knowledge, and influence had ensured the dead would remain anonymous. And if this secrecy extended for generations, it would explain why no church, no archive, and no family record survived. The caretaker's words also raised terrifying questions. Who were they? Officials? Landowners? Military authorities? And what kind of trouble were they trying to prevent? Public outrage, investigation, or the acknowledgement of crimes best forgotten? The blacked-out pages. The investigators encountered one of the most mysterious artifacts in the archives, a set of government correspondence heavily redacted. Large swaths of text had been blacked out, leaving only tantalizing fragments. In one memo, a line hinted at a burial protocol for those considered inconvenient or unclaimed. Another mentioned ensuring that names are never recorded in perpetuity. Even the fragments told a story of systematic erasure. They suggested coordination between multiple institutions, religious, governmental, and perhaps even military. Someone at a high level had deemed these people unworthy of remembrance, and every step had been taken to enforce that judgment. Oral testimonies and gaps in memory. Official records, however, were not the only source of information. Oral testimonies revealed a pattern of institutional secrecy reinforced over generations. Elders in nearby villages repeatedly warned investigators not to talk about the cemetery. Some cited fear of repercussions. Others spoke of shame or guilt. One woman recounted her grandmother's warning, "Never go near that field. Don't ask questions. Some things are better left buried." Another elder admitted that local priests and officials had discouraged families from visiting the graves or documenting deaths. These repeated silences, the kind enforced socially, psychologically, and institutionally, reinforced the idea that someone had gone to great lengths to erase memory itself. Layered erasure, a systemic approach. What became increasingly clear to the investigators was that the erasure was not haphazard. It was layered, systematic, and deliberate. Physical anonymity, graves left unmarked, bodies buried without names. Documentary destruction, church ledgers torn, blacked out, or missing. Government archives burned or damaged. Social enforcement, villagers and caretakers instructed not to speak, discouraging oral history. Legal invisibility, redacted documents hinting at burial protocols designed to prevent accountability. Each layer reinforced the others, creating an almost impenetrable wall between the dead and the living. Implications of deliberate erasure. The implications of such erasure are profound. When a person's life is removed from memory, when no name survives, no record exists, no story is told, they effectively cease to exist in society's collective consciousness. This cemetery, then, is not just a place of death. It is a monument to the power of forgetting. It is a place where human beings were denied the dignity of remembrance, where the living actively conspired to erase them from history. And the ethical weight of this knowledge was not lost on the investigators. For Dr. Varma, Ravi, and Dr. Lyon, uncovering this truth meant confronting uncomfortable questions about justice, responsibility, and complicity, not just in the past, but in the present. Foreshadowing the next revelation, even with the records destroyed and the social silence enforced, traces remained. Personal items buried with the dead. Skeletal anomalies hinting at violence. Faint fragments of documents that survived the fire. Each clue offered a glimmer of understanding while simultaneously raising new questions. The investigators realized that while the records had vanished, the truth itself could not be buried completely. The soil, the bones, and the artifacts preserved fragments of what the living tried to erase. And those fragments pointed to something far darker than simple neglect, a systematic effort to hide crimes, and perhaps prevent accountability for atrocities long committed. Every name unrecorded, every ledger burned, every whispered warning added to the weight of the mystery. The cemetery was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was a puzzle with moral, social, and possibly legal consequences. And the next step, when the investigators began to piece together the physical evidence with what little documentation survived, would bring them closer than ever to confronting the full horror of what had occurred. After months of painstaking excavation, archival research, and interviews with locals, the investigators reached a turning point. What had started as a theoretical mystery, a cemetery of nameless graves, was beginning to take shape as a tangible, horrifying reality. Every tool, every measurement, every artifact collected added pieces to the puzzle. But the discoveries weren't merely academic, they were visceral, immediate, and chilling. Skeletons Speak. Dr. Marcus Lyon, the forensic archaeologist, described the moment he first realized the cemetery held more than random burials. We began to see patterns. The way bodies were arranged, the injuries on the bones, even the objects buried with them, they were not random. There was intention here. Deliberate placement. Deliberate concealment. In one cluster, skeletons were stacked in layers, adults on the bottom, adolescents in the middle, and children on top. Some displayed clear evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, broken ribs, and bound wrists. Others bore signs of malnutrition or chronic illness. It became evident that this was not just a cemetery for the poor or for plague victims. Some deaths had been deliberate, violent, and systematically hidden. Artifacts and fragments of identity among the soil and bones, the team unearthed personal items, a child's worn shoe, a silver locket, a brass button from a uniform, a fragment of a prayer book. Each object was a whisper from the past, a fragment of someone's life denied recognition. Dr. Varma explained, these items were never meant to survive. They were hidden, almost discarded. Yet they tell us that each person buried here had a story, a life, a place in the world. And those lives were erased intentionally. The artifacts also offered hints about the social and ethnic diversity of the buried population. Buttons from distant regions, fragments of foreign fabric, and decorative beads suggested that this cemetery was not just local. It held outsiders, migrants, and perhaps even prisoners from far away. Unearthing signs of violence. One of the most shocking discoveries involved a section where dozens of skeletons displayed trauma inconsistent with disease or natural death. Broken jaws, fractured limbs, and bindings on wrists and ankles suggested restraint. Some skulls showed evidence of repeated blunt force impacts. For the team, this was the first physical confirmation of what had only been hinted at in folklore and fragmented records: systematic killing, or at the very least, forced death under suspicious circumstances. Ravi, the archivist, put it bluntly, we are not dealing with an accident, an epidemic, or neglect alone. There's clear evidence that these deaths were orchestrated, and someone took steps to hide them. The scale was staggering. Hundreds, possibly thousands of people had been deliberately buried without identification, and most of their stories had been wiped from history. The map and burial patterns. The tattered map found in the archives began to make sense in light of the discoveries. Excavation confirmed that the graves were not randomly placed but followed an irregular grid that had been used over multiple centuries. The map's label, for the unclaimed, took on a sinister clarity. It was more than a descriptor. It was a blueprint. Patterns in the graves revealed repeated layering. Older skeletons were sometimes pushed aside or partially covered to accommodate new burials. The ground itself bore the weight of intentional concealment, a strategy repeated over generations to ensure these individuals were never rediscovered. Dr. Lyon summarized, "This was not a graveyard in the traditional sense. It was a living plan of concealment, adapted and reused across time. Someone, or some institution, maintained it meticulously." Evidence from the soil analysis revealed chemical anomalies consistent with repeated decomposition in the same areas, along with traces of substances that might have accelerated decay. Pockets of lime, charcoal, and ash suggested deliberate attempts to obscure bodies further. Even more unsettling were isolated clusters that hinted at hasty or secretive burial, graves dug too shallow, bodies placed in unnatural positions, artifacts scattered or destroyed. Every detail reinforced the impression of intentional erasure. The investigators realized that the earth itself was a record, one that had survived where paper, stone, and memory had failed. Human stories reconstructed despite the lack of names, the team began reconstructing possible narratives from the evidence. A woman buried clutching a rosary, a child's shoes positioned carefully beside tiny remains, a young man with a uniform button suggesting military service. These reconstructions gave emotional depth to the investigation, reminding the team, and the audience, that these were not just bones. They were lives stolen, silenced, and hidden from history. Dr. Varma described the emotional toll. "We can never know their names. But by piecing together their lives, even in fragments, we give them a voice. We acknowledge that they existed, that they mattered. And in doing so, we fight against the very erasure that created this place." First glimpses of a larger conspiracy. The combination of skeletal evidence, artifacts, and surviving records began pointing to a chilling possibility: the cemetery was more than a dumping ground. It may have been part of a broader, deliberate system of concealment, an effort to hide inconvenient deaths, suppress dissent, and erase marginalized communities from memory. Some artifacts suggested connections to state or military authority. Uniform fragments, official-looking documents buried alongside bodies, and references to controlled burial procedures implied coordination. The erasure was not incidental. It was methodical. This revelation escalated the mystery from historical curiosity to potential historical crime. The investigators realized they were no longer just uncovering a cemetery, they were uncovering evidence of a hidden, centuries-long effort to silence people after death. The emotional weight of discovery. The breakthroughs brought exhilaration, but also horror. Every layer of discovery added clarity, and emotional weight. Team members described sleepless nights haunted by the silent faces of those they had unearthed. The juxtaposition of meticulous science and human tragedy created a tension they could not ignore. Dr. Lyon said, "Excavating a grave is never just science. It's a confrontation with mortality, with injustice, with memory itself. Here, it's multiplied by thousands." For Ravi and Dr. Varma, the discoveries confirmed a fundamental truth: the cemetery was a testament to both human cruelty and human neglect, and the only way to honor the dead was to expose the full truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. Foreshadowing the climax, the discoveries in the soil, the bones, and the artifacts set the stage for the investigation's next phase. The team now had enough evidence to move beyond speculation, to piece together who might have orchestrated the erasure, and why. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous the questions became. Some evidence suggested deliberate killings spanning decades. Some suggested coordination between powerful entities. And every new revelation left a haunting implication: the cemetery's mystery was far from over, and the truth, when fully revealed, might be darker than anyone imagined. As the team prepared for the next stage, combining archival research, forensic analysis, and oral testimony, they understood one thing clearly: this was no longer just a historical investigation. It was a confrontation with the forces that sought to erase lives, and they were racing against time to restore memory before the cemetery's secrets were lost forever. By the time the investigators reached this stage, the cemetery was no longer a mystery of soil and bones, it was a haunting testament to deliberate erasure. The breakthrough discoveries had revealed layers of violence, neglect, and concealment spanning centuries. But the question that had gripped every researcher and local historian remained: who were these people? Piecing together the skeletal evidence, artifacts, oral testimonies, and surviving documents, the investigators began to reconstruct fragments of identities, revealing a terrifying mosaic of lives lost, silenced, and hidden. The Forgotten Soldiers' analysis of uniform fragments, weapon remnants, and skeletal trauma suggested that many of the graves held soldiers. Young men in their late teens and 20s, conscripted into wars that spanned generations, had died in battle, captivity, or execution. One discovery was particularly chilling: a cluster of skeletons bound and buried together, bearing signs of blunt force trauma. The team concluded these were likely prisoners or rebels executed without trial, their deaths intentionally hidden. Oral accounts from local historians hinted at unrecorded skirmishes and forgotten uprisings. Entire battalions may have been marched to this cemetery under the cover of darkness, buried in silence, and erased from all official records. For Dr. Varma, the implications were harrowing. These weren't just names lost to time, she said. These were lives systematically removed from history because someone decided they didn't matter. The children of neglect. Even more heartbreaking were the graves of infants and young children. Tiny skeletons, some less than a year old, were found clustered together in shallow graves. Artifacts such as broken toys, rosary beads, and fragments of clothing suggested these were children from poor families or institutional care. The skeletal evidence showed signs of malnutrition, disease, and in some cases, restraint. Combined with historical reports of orphanages and workhouses in the area, the investigators concluded that many children may have died under conditions of neglect or abuse, buried hastily and anonymously. Ravi, the archivist, described the emotional toll. Each child we uncovered reminded us that erasure was a choice. Someone decided these lives were unworthy of record, and that silence has lasted for centuries. Women silenced among the graves. There were women of varying ages, young mothers, elderly caregivers, and adolescents. Many displayed evidence of trauma inconsistent with natural causes: fractures to wrists and skulls, bound hands, and signs of malnutrition. Artifacts like small religious charms and fragments of jewelry hinted at their personal lives, stolen in death. The investigators hypothesized that some women may have been victims of domestic violence, institutional neglect, or even execution for perceived transgressions, their deaths deliberately obscured to avoid scandal. In interviews with local elders, stories of women taken and never returned surfaced, corroborating the evidence that some deaths had been concealed intentionally, and that the cemetery may have served as a controlled burial ground for those deemed inconvenient. Marginalized communities' isotopic analysis of skeletal remains revealed that many individuals were not native to the surrounding region. Migrants, laborers, and possibly prisoners from distant towns or regions had been buried here. These findings suggested that marginalized groups, people without family, wealth, or social standing, were systematically hidden in death. The cemetery became a tool of social control, a place where authorities or institutions could erase inconvenient lives without attracting attention. Dr. Lyon summarized, "This cemetery is a record of inequality, violence, and societal neglect. The unclaimed dead were not random. They were specifically chosen for invisibility." Evidence of repeated use. The layering of graves over centuries revealed a disturbing pattern. This was not a one-time tragedy. Epidemics, wars, and institutional abuses created repeated waves of death, and each time, the same method was employed: bodies buried without names, records destroyed or altered, families silenced. Artifacts from different periods, buttons, coins, religious items, fragments of clothing, demonstrated this continuity. It became clear that the cemetery was not a historical accident, but a deliberately maintained system of concealment spanning generations. This repeated use magnified the horror. It suggested a society that, for decades or centuries, chose to erase certain lives from memory, ensuring their deaths remained unacknowledged. The first human connections. Despite anonymity, the team made startling connections between certain graves. Clusters of infants with matching artifacts suggested families. Groups of bound adults with similar trauma indicated organized executions. Women buried near children hinted at mothers who died alongside or shortly after their offspring, possibly from neglect, disease, or violence. Though the identities were lost, these patterns revealed human relationships, stories of care, fear, and tragedy, lives intertwined even in death. Dr. Varma emphasized the importance: names may be gone, but relationships remain. We can reconstruct the humanity that was denied recognition, and in doing so, honor these people in a way that the original erasers never allowed. Hints of deliberate erasure. Perhaps the most shocking revelation was the consistency with which evidence of identity had been removed. Personal items were scarce, skeletal injuries often suggested intentional concealment, and records, when they existed, were redacted or destroyed. Even cemeteries that contained unclaimed or poor individuals often left minimal records or traces. Here, the effort to erase was comprehensive, spanning documents, oral histories, and material evidence. The investigators concluded that this was not neglect. It was systematic erasure. Someone, over generations, had actively sought to remove these lives from collective memory. The emotional impact on investigators. The psychological weight on the team was profound. Each new discovery added a layer of sorrow, anger, and moral responsibility. Uncovering mass trauma without names, without closure, forced the investigators to confront a fundamental ethical question: how do we honor lives intentionally erased from history? Ravi described walking among the graves at dusk. You feel eyes on you, though there is no one there. You hear whispers in the wind, names that will never be spoken aloud. It is overwhelming, but it drives you forward. These people demand acknowledgement, even if we can only give fragments. Dr. Lyon added, every excavation is a confrontation with humanity's capacity for cruelty and neglect. And yet, it's also a reminder of the resilience of memory, that even buried, these lives still speak. The narrative cliffhanger. By the end of Section 9, the investigators had pieced together a chilling tableau of who was buried here: soldiers, rebels, and executed prisoners, children neglected or abused in institutional care, women silenced by violence or societal prejudice, migrants and marginalized communities deliberately erased. Yet the biggest question remained unresolved: who orchestrated this erasure? Was it local authorities, religious institutions, or broader governmental powers? And what secrets did the cemetery hold that made such concealment necessary? These unanswered questions set the stage for the final sections of the documentary: the confrontation with ultimate truths, the moral reckoning, and the haunting conclusion. The nameless dead had been partially revealed, but the forces behind their erasure remained a shadowy, terrifying presence, one that the investigators were determined to confront, no matter the cost. After months of painstaking excavation, research, and interviews, the investigators reached the point where fragments of evidence converged into a chilling, undeniable reality. The cemetery, once an abstraction of nameless graves, now revealed a story that was horrifying in both scale and intention. The dead, long silenced, had finally begun to speak through the soil, the bones, and the artifacts that survived centuries of deliberate erasure. The consolidation of evidence. Dr. Marcus Lyon gathered the skeletal evidence, artifacts, and site maps, overlaying them with surviving archival fragments and oral testimonies. The patterns were undeniable: graves were stacked in deliberate layers, often rearranged to accommodate new burials. Trauma on skeletons suggested violent deaths in numerous cases: restrained hands, fractured skulls, and broken limbs indicated systematic killing. Personal items, though scarce, hinted at familial ties, professions, social status, and ethnic diversity. Historical records, though heavily redacted or destroyed, corroborated the notion that authorities had instructed caretakers, priests, and local officials to obscure the cemetery. Ravi Deshmukh, the archivist, summarized the investigation's central truth: this wasn't chaos. It was method. The erasure was intentional, consistent, and maintained over generations. Whoever orchestrated it wanted these lives forgotten, completely and permanently. The moral reckoning for the investigators, the revelations carried a heavy ethical weight. It was one thing to uncover a historical mystery. It was another to confront the systemic erasure of thousands of human lives, many of them children, women, and marginalized individuals. Dr. Varma reflected, the real horror isn't just in the deaths themselves. It's in the deliberate decision to erase these people from memory, to treat their existence as expendable. That's cruelty of a different kind, cruelty that survives beyond the grave. The team grappled with moral questions. How do you honor lives deliberately erased from history? How do you confront institutions that may have participated, knowingly or unknowingly, in a centuries-long act of suppression? The answer became clear: meticulous documentation, careful reconstruction, and public acknowledgement were their only tools. They could not give the dead their names back, but they could ensure that their stories, fragmented though they were, would not vanish again. Confronting the shadows of power. As archival research deepened, troubling connections emerged. Correspondence and redacted records suggested coordination among local authorities, religious institutions, and possibly regional governments. The cemetery had been maintained as a controlled burial ground, a place for lives deemed inconvenient or unworthy of recognition. Some documents referenced orders to conceal deaths during epidemics, political purges, or institutional failures. Others hinted at punitive measures for marginalized groups. The scope of deliberate erasure spanned decades, if not centuries, pointing to a systemic culture of silencing, rather than isolated incidents. Ravi noted, we aren't just uncovering graves. We're uncovering the machinery of forgetting, a society's deliberate choice to erase people from history. Artifacts as silent witnesses. Physical artifacts, though often fragmentary, served as silent witnesses to these lives. A child's tiny shoe suggested playfulness cut short. A woman's rosary, delicately preserved, hinted at devotion denied recognition. Uniform fragments and weapon remnants hinted at soldiers executed in secrecy. Even these small items carried weight. They reminded the team that each grave was more than a statistic, it was a life stolen from remembrance, a story suppressed, a person denied dignity in both death and memory. The investigators began cataloging these artifacts not only as archaeological evidence but as testaments to humanity, a moral obligation to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The first glimmers of identity. Through a combination of isotopic analysis, material culture, and oral histories, the team began to piece together potential identities for some individuals, soldiers conscripted into wars long forgotten, executed or dying in captivity. Children from orphanages, workhouses, or impoverished families, victims of neglect and disease. Women subject to violence or institutional abuse, often buried alongside their children. Migrants and marginalized individuals, removed from society's records to prevent acknowledgement of social injustice. Though names remained unknown, these reconstructions provided emotional depth, humanizing the nameless dead and connecting viewers to the tragedy in a profoundly personal way. Dr. Varma observed, we may never know their names, but we can know their lives, their struggles, their deaths. That is the closest we can come to justice. The scale of horror. As the team consolidated their findings, the scale of deliberate erasure became undeniable. The cemetery was not merely a pauper's grave or a plague pit. It was a systematic, repeated, multi-generational effort to erase inconvenient lives, lives that were poor, powerless, or politically inconvenient. Every layer of earth told a story of cruelty and neglect. Every artifact hinted at a stolen existence. Every destroyed record confirmed that the living had conspired to silence the dead. The investigators faced a daunting realization: they were dealing with a historical crime whose consequences echoed into the present. The erasure had robbed families, communities, and even the broader society of truth, memory, and accountability. Confronting emotional and physical haunting, the investigators also confronted the personal and psychological effects of their work. Long days in the field, nights cataloging skeletons, and the emotional weight of unearthing lives deliberately silenced created a pervasive sense of unease. Some reported feeling watched, as if the dead themselves were observing the excavation. Cameras sometimes captured unexplained shadows. Instruments detected temperature anomalies near certain graves. While some dismissed these as coincidence, the eerie atmosphere reinforced the sense that the cemetery resisted complete understanding. Dr. Lyon described it as, the weight of history pressing down on us, not just the dead, but the intentions behind their erasure. It's almost as if the ground remembers what humans tried to forget. The narrative climax. By the end of their investigation, the evidence coalesced into a chilling narrative, a cemetery spanning centuries, meticulously maintained to conceal inconvenient deaths. Mass graves containing victims of violence, neglect, disease, and political persecution. Systematic erasure enforced through destroyed records, silenced communities, and redacted official documents. Fragments of artifacts revealing the humanity of those lost. Oral histories confirming that silence was enforced across generations. This narrative left no doubt, the cemetery was not accidental. It was a deliberate instrument of power, control, and suppression, a dark chapter of history that had remained hidden for far too long. The haunting conclusion. The final realization weighed heavily on the team. The nameless dead had been silenced not only in life but in death. Yet, paradoxically, the very effort to erase them ensured their story would endure once uncovered. Dr. Varma concluded, this cemetery reminds us that memory is both fragile and resilient. Those who sought to erase these lives failed in the end. The soil, the artifacts, the bones, they testify that these people existed, that they suffered, and that they deserve acknowledgement. We may not restore their names, but we can restore their presence in history. The investigators left the cemetery with a mix of exhaustion, sorrow, and reverence. They had confronted centuries of deliberate cruelty, uncovered hidden stories, and given voice to lives that had been denied recognition. Yet the cemetery itself remained, silent but speaking, a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and remembrance. Foreshadowing eternal mystery. Even as the investigation concluded, some questions lingered. Who specifically ordered these erasures? How many lives remain unaccounted for? And how many other cemeteries, archives, and forgotten spaces hold similar truths, waiting to be uncovered? The mystery was partially solved, yet its shadow extended far beyond the graves themselves. The cemetery remained a moral and historical mirror, forcing the living to confront the consequences of forgetting, silence, and deliberate erasure. In the end, the investigators understood a sobering truth: some stories may never be fully told, but acknowledging their existence is the closest we come to justice. The cemetery, once a place of oblivion, had finally begun to speak, its silence transformed into testimony, its nameless dead finally recognized. The sun was beginning to set over the cemetery as the investigators took their final survey. Rows of unmarked graves stretched across the horizon, silent witnesses to centuries of lives erased. Yet, unlike the past, these graves would not remain forgotten. The months of excavation, analysis, and documentation had transformed a place of erasure into a space of remembrance. This final section of the investigation was less about discovery and more about reflection, about understanding the lasting impact of silence, the resilience of memory, and the moral obligation to honor the nameless dead. Transforming silence into testimony. The cemetery had been designed to silence the dead. Yet, in exposing it, the investigators realized that silence is never absolute. Bones, artifacts, soil, and even whispered local stories had survived centuries of deliberate erasure. Dr. Varma reflected, we cannot undo the past. We cannot give names back to every grave. But we can listen. We can tell their stories, piece together their lives, and ensure that the world remembers. Memory is the closest we come to justice. In a sense, the cemetery became a voice, a haunting, persistent voice that demanded acknowledgement. Every fragment of evidence, every child's shoe, every rosary bead, every bound skeleton became a testament to lives that had been denied recognition. Legacy of the nameless. The team understood that the cemetery's story was bigger than individual victims. It was a symbol of societal failure, of prejudice, neglect, and deliberate erasure. Yet, it also became a symbol of resilience. The dead may have been silenced in life and in death, but they could not be erased completely. Artifacts and skeletal evidence, combined with meticulous documentation, created a narrative that transcended names. They told of soldiers, children, women, migrants, and marginalized individuals who had lived, loved, suffered, and ultimately been denied acknowledgement. Ravi, the archivist, said quietly, even without names, these lives mattered. The act of remembering, of recording, of acknowledging them, that is how we fight back against centuries of deliberate forgetting. Connecting the living and the dead. One of the most profound impacts of the investigation was the way it bridged the gap between the living and the dead. Local communities who had long avoided speaking about the cemetery began to confront its presence. Oral histories were shared, memories recounted, and a collective recognition emerged that the cemetery was not just a historical site but a moral and cultural responsibility. Dr. Lyon observed, "Archaeology is not just about bones. It's about people, connecting the living with those who came before. Here, the living are finally listening to the voices of the dead." Even in cases where names could never be recovered, the act of acknowledging the dead created an enduring bond. By bearing witness, the living ensured that the cemetery's residents would not be erased again. Haunting reflections. As the investigators walked among the graves at dusk, shadows stretched long across the mounds, giving the cemetery an almost ethereal quality. The silence that had once been oppressive now felt reverent. The nameless dead had been partially revealed, but their presence remained haunting. Some graves likely contained victims of violence, some of neglect, some of disease, and yet, all shared the same fate, anonymity imposed by deliberate human action. Dr. Varma spoke of the emotional toll. You can study bones and documents, but you cannot study absence without feeling it. The weight of silence is enormous. And yet, every time we uncover a fragment, we push back against that silence. This confrontation with absence became a moral meditation, a reminder that forgetting is not neutral. Erasure is an act of power, and remembrance is an act of resistance. Cinematic reflection. The stories that survived. The team realized that the cemetery, in its silence, told the ultimate story, that of human resilience in the face of oblivion. While individuals may remain nameless, patterns of life, relationships, trauma, and survival persisted. Children buried together told of families, communities, and the cruelty of neglect. Bound adults and soldiers told of power, punishment, and hidden conflicts. Women interred alongside children told of maternal bonds and suffering imposed by society or institutions. The cemetery became a cinematic tableau, a visual, emotional narrative of forgotten lives, now partially restored through careful investigation. The audience, much like the investigators, is left with a tension between horror and reverence, between loss and acknowledgement. Every artifact, every skeletal arrangement, every oral testimony creates layers of meaning that resonate long after the camera has moved on. A legacy of responsibility. In the final reckoning, the investigators understood that the cemetery was not just a historical curiosity, it was a moral imperative. By documenting, publishing, and sharing their findings, they ensured that the nameless dead could influence the present. Society, they realized, bears responsibility for remembering those deliberately erased. Forgetting is a choice, but remembrance is a duty. Dr. Lyon reflected, history is never truly dead. It lives in the soil, in the bones, in the stories we tell. And our duty is to keep it alive. The cemetery's lesson extends beyond its geographic location. It is a reminder that memory is fragile, that injustice can persist in silence, and that recognition, even partial, is a form of justice. Closing scene. Eternal echoes. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the cemetery took on a quiet dignity. The investigators left, their work documented, their stories ready to be shared with the world. But the site itself remained, a haunting presence, a reminder of lives deliberately erased, yet now partially recovered through the persistence of human curiosity, compassion, and moral responsibility. The final frame is not one of resolution in the traditional sense. Names remain lost. Crimes may never be fully traced to perpetrators. But memory endures, and through documentation, public acknowledgement, and continued reflection, the dead finally speak. In the stillness of the evening, one can almost hear whispers in the wind, fragments of names, memories of lives, echoes of existence. The cemetery, once a void, now resonates with testimony, a haunting, beautiful, and enduring reminder that even in anonymity, life cannot be completely erased.